Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson, shooting today at the Ronald Reagan Library in Simi Valley, California. Born in Prague in 1941 during the Second World War, Václav Klaus grew up in the communist Czechoslovakia during the Cold War. After earning a doctorate in economics, he pursued a career in academia and at the Czechoslovak State Bank. Immediately after the Velvet Revolution of 1989, Mr. Klaus entered politics. A founder of the Civic Democratic Party, he served from 1992 to 1997 as Prime Minister of the Czech Republic. In 2003, he was elected President, the position to which he was re-elected last year. Mr. President, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Segment 1, November 9th, 1989. Where were you when you learned that the Berlin Wall had been opened?
Well, I was definitely in Prague, in my country, and for us it was one of the successive events which started in the middle of the year 1989, and 1 week, 1 month after another, there was one important achievement, one important event. So at that moment for me, the Berlin Wall was just part of the chain, not a specific dominant.
When did you sense that an opening would take place? When did you know that things were finally afoot?
Well, I think that the second half of the 1980s was already a situation when the things had been changing, and it accelerated during the 1989, the whole year, and then I think that the first real thing was the formation of the new Polish government after Polish negotiations, and that was something I understood as a real change.
We're celebrating the 20th anniversary of the Velvet Revolution, which means, I'm afraid, that nobody under the age of about 30 has any real knowledge of the system in which you grew up. For the sake, let's say, of my children or your grandchildren, what do they need to understand? What do they need to grasp as a historical lived reality about what life under communism was like?
Well, I think it's very difficult to explain to people how the life under communism was. I see it, my children, let's say, my older son is 40 years old, so he was 20 in the moment of the fall of communism, and the younger is 35, which means he was 15. I think they both understand very well, but they are the last who understand, and I even see difference between my older and younger sons, because the 15 years old understands it a little bit less, I must say. So I'm not very optimistic about the possibility to explain to the people now, as you put it, below 30, what was it really difficult. We try to do it permanently. We try to do it at schools. There are many programs on TV. Nevertheless, I think it's difficult.
I've heard you say, Mr. President, that 2 facts about the end of the Cold War are true. The first is that communism was rotten within, but the second was also that the actions of other governments, particularly Reagan and Thatcher, were vital. Explain the relative, for us as Americans, the relative weight of that is important to try to grasp.
I am an economist who always try to have quantitative results, but in such a complex system, to be able to say exactly what was the relative role of individual factors is difficult. The crucial thing definitely was the internal one. The communism was, I always say communism collapsed. Communism sort of melted down. Communism was not almost, I would say, defeated, even if some of my compatriots are not happy with that, because they think they were the heroes who defeated communism. So communism was already too weak, soft, old, deprived of all meaning. There was even nobody who defended seriously communism. I was joking in the 1980s that when some foreigners came and asked me, but do people really believe in communism? My answer, not now, ex post, at that time, in the 1980, my answer was, look, well, I'm absolutely sure that there are more true believers in communism and Marxism at the University of California, Berkeley, than in the whole communist Czechoslovakia. So there was no one really believing. The people who tried to defend the ideology and the system as such, it was almost a non-existent grouping. So the system was already weak, and so the question was only what should be the last drop, what should be the last thing to happen. Definitely the communist bosses didn't want to voluntarily give up and say, please, we understood that it was wrong and you now go ahead. Definitely not. The only real internal force in all the communist countries was the Polish Solidarność. I know that there were individual, well-known, more abroad than at home, dissidents in countries like my country, but they were not able to create a real movement. They were not connected. In this respect, solidarity stands at a totally different level. So the real mover in this respect was the tough position of people like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, who pushed Russia to very complicated situations, and they succeeded in this respect.
Segment 2, Mr. President. Europe today. Treaty of Lisbon, document dating from 2007. The treaty will create a president of the European Union and restrict the ability of national governments to veto certain EU actions. Let me quote you to yourself, 2 quotations. President Václav Klaus in 2005, quote, "In Europe we witness the crowding out of democracy by post-democracy, a bureaucratic unification of the European continent that shifts government upwards to the level where there is no democratic accountability and the decisions are made by politicians, appointed by politicians, not elected by citizens in free elections," close quote.
Did I say it in such a nice way?
You said it beautifully, yes.
Thank you very much.
President Václav Klaus last month, quote, "The train has already traveled so far that it will not be possible to stop it or turn it around." What happened?
Well, one thing is whether when speaking about the metaphor of the train,
yes,
is at the second quotation was about the ratification of the Lisbon Treaty. In this respect, I think it was already too far, and it
26 of 27 countries had already ratified it. You were the last.
Plus a strong pressure inside the country from all those involved closely with various benefits coming from the European Union difficult. So that quotation was meant, I must say, more to the ratification of the Lisbon Treaty than to the long-term developments on the European continent. In this respect, one must be optimistic, and we know that we have to go on. There is no end of history. There is no end of changes, and in this respect, I am not that pessimistic. But for the time being, the fighting for the Lisbon Treaty was impossible, even if I know that majority of Europeans is not happy with the treaty. No one country dared to make a referendum about it, because it's absolutely sure that in many countries of the EU, I recently met an important ambassador from an important Western European country who came to say hello after completing 4 years in my country, and I wouldn't say who was that, but he said, well, in our country it would not be possible to make a referendum. It's absolutely clear that the majority of the people would kill the treaty.
For Americans, of course, our national sovereignty is a given matter. It's not a complicated issue at all. So it's difficult. I guess what I'm asking you to do as the president of a country that lives within the European Union, but at the same time immensely values its own sovereignty. How do you see this? I mean, I have this the famous quotation from Mrs. Thatcher in which she warned against we did not reclaim our liberties only to lose them to a superstate in Brussels.
Well, this is you could find similar quotations
From you.
given by me in this respect. I feel very similarly in this respect. You know, it has several dimensions. The first one. We lived in a very oppressive regime which was controlled not from our own capital, from Prague, but it was controlled from Moscow. We lived without any sovereignty. More or less, I sometimes say we lived without borders, because I wouldn't call the Iron Curtain a border.
Right.
Methodologically, it was not a border in a standard sense of what the term border means. You know, so after the fall of we speak now about the Berlin Wall, but Iron Curtain.
Right.
You know, well, I would have enjoyed to spend the rest of my life with normal borders. We were deprived of having passports and the ability to travel to the United States of America or I don't know where, to Spain or Sweden. So for me, to have a valid passport with the ability to cross the border, to spend 30 seconds showing my passport, you know, that would have been sufficient. So I don't need the European unification and the Schengen agreement and no borders in Europe and no passports in Europe, and which means that I can take my car and go today from Prague to Lisbon as you go from New York City to Los Angeles. You know, so I'm unhappy also with that. The third point is that the Americans usually don't understand what we mean by criticizing the European unification. Well, they say, well, we are in United States of America, so why are not you so unhappy with the possible United States of Europe? We live now after the ratification of the Lisbon Treaty in the United States of Europe, even if it is called differently. But that's not the point. The substance is really such. So, and the Americans usually have problems to understand it. And I tell them, look, you, if I'm not wrong, you have been trying for the last decade or more to form another integration. You call it NAFTA. It's the integration with Canada and Mexico. I think you know many problems, but can you imagine that someone would tell you that to have three independent currencies, US dollar, Canadian dollar, and peso, that it's a wrong idea? So what about making one single currency area called peso dollar or something like that, or NAFTOR, or
right,
NAFTOR would be a great idea. You know, and they look at me. You ask, "Are you serious?" I say, "No, I am serious. This is exactly what is going on in Europe these days. Would you be ready to get rid of your government and to create a different government in which would be a government for all the three countries together?" And then when I try to argue along those lines, the Americans, it seems to me, start to grasp a little bit my criticism of it.
Mr. President, segment 3, former Vice President Al Gore, quote, "The vast majority of scientists agree that global warming is real," close quote. Now let me quote you again, President Václav Klaus, quote, "Global warming is a myth, and every serious person and scientist says so." What do you know that Al Gore doesn't?
I don't know what he knows. I don't believe that he is that much interested either in science or in economics of global warming, politics, and so on. He is interested, as a typical politician, he simply understood that the idea of global warming is an excellent political idea. When someone fights climate, he looks very unegoistic, very altruistic, forward-looking. If the politicians have been searching for such a beautiful idea for decades, and they finally found that idea. So this is a cheap argumentation. This is great. You promise something to cut down the CO2 emissions in the year 2050 by first 20%, 30%, 50%, 80%. Now I heard 120%. You know, and the same politicians are saying it in a couple of years. It's so easy to know that you have 4 years term, which terminates in the year 2010, and you promise to do something in the year 2060, 2080. That's absolutely great. You will not be taken responsible. Nobody would control, nobody would remember. I remember G8 meeting in Germany, northern Germany, some 2 years ago, and they made the promise, 8 leaders made the promise to cut emissions by 50%. Now it's a lost idea, 50. Now everyone wants more. 50% till the year 2050. Out of those 8 politicians, 3 lost their office in 2 weeks' time. Again, it's so easy to make such promises. They will not...
Communism in the old days, global warming today. Here's the question. Is there some deep, permanent, statist temptation in Western culture?
Well, I wouldn't...
Are they related, or is that unfair?
Well, no. I would qualify the question a little bit. You can't compare communism with global warming. You must compare communism with the ideology of environmentalism or the ideology of global warming alarmism. That's a difference. Right. Global warming is not a reality.
It's objectively verifiable.
It is verifiable issue. It's difficult to verify. Nevertheless, it's another issue. So we are talking about 2 ideologies, and in this respect, they are structurally very similar. They are against individual freedom. They are in favor of centralistic masterminding of our fates. They are both very similar in telling us what to do, how to live, how to behave, what to eat, how to travel, what we can do and what we cannot do, and so on. There is a huge similarity in this respect, but the similarity of ideologies, not similarity of whether there is some warming or not.
Segment 4, economist and head of state. How did you become a free market economist, or at least devoted to the principles of free markets, studying economics in a communist regime? How did that happen?
Well, I studied economics in the communist regime first, and I studied it in the still very dark communist days. Nevertheless, which means I studied Marxist political economy, nevertheless, I entered the Institute of Economics of Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences, and paradoxically, I entered the department as a graduate student, which studied not socialist or communist economic system, but which was supposed to criticize the capitalist system and to criticize the non-Marxist economic theories. So that was my job, more or less. So I was supposed to study them, to understand them.
They forced you to study capitalism.
They no forced. They paid me for.
They paid you.
They paid me for studying it. So I came into that field, and I got the Samuelson textbooks, and I tried to fully understand it. Then I started to discover the criticism of Samuelson's approach. I discovered Hayek, Milton Friedman, and Stigler, and Gary Becker, and
you became a Chicago boy.
All those people. So it was on the one hand the question of my studying economics, and it was not studying communist economics. Right. It was studying American authors, and I always try to explain to the Americans that in the dark communist days, it was a miracle to get from someone who came from abroad one copy of Time magazine or Newsweek. That was already something, and I read it from the first page to the last page. So even the book reviews and things like that. But all the time, in the library of the Institute of Economics of the Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences, it was possible to take the American Economic Review, Journal of Political Economy, Review of Economics and Statistics, and so on. So for me to study such sophisticated scientific quarterly journals was possible, you know. But the second source of my being in favor of free markets was the experience, the life under communist regime, and you immediately you understood how irrational the whole system is, and in this respect that was even as important as the theoretical studies.
Well, here's what I'm getting at. Here I have seated across from me a man with a doctorate, deeply dedicated to free markets, with a detailed professional economist's understanding of the importance of free markets. And the Heritage Foundation's 2009 Index of Economic Freedom ranks the Czech Republic 21st out of 43 European nations. So there's greater economic freedom, according to the Heritage Foundation, in Denmark, Switzerland, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, Germany, Austria, Spain. And so the question is, how can this be?
Well, I'm
sure that if you were Lee Kuan Yew, if you were in charge of your economy the way Lee Kuan Yew were in charge of Singapore,
Singapore was not a democratic economy, so
this is my question.
He was able to achieve something.
Now that you've experienced democracy for 2 decades, are you sanguine about the prospects of democracy producing truly free markets?
Well, two issues. The first one is I am a big supporter and friend of Heritage Foundation and Ed Fellner, and I am not discussing the ranking of the Czech Republic. I think that the methodology of those indices is simply not good. But I disagree with those international comparisons.
Is the experience of the United States, and even more so of Western Europe, inevitable? That is to say, the constant ratchet, the expansion of the welfare state. Can that be? This is what I'm really asking, I suppose. After 2 decades as a democracy, what is your opinion as an economist and a political practitioner?
You know, first, I still think that the economic freedom in my country is bigger than in Western European countries. That I'm absolutely
Not
sure.
close.
But the real problem is that the first decade was a radical increase of economic reform. Every measure we introduced at that time was aiming at that direction. Then slowly the process of approaching the European Union started. And then I remember sitting on the cabinet meeting and discussing the draft of a of a bill prepared by Ministry of something, and and we were discussing whether to send it to the Parliament, and a standard issue was. I said, well, but look, if you look at the paragraphs number 22, 23, 24, again, unnecessary regulation, unnecessary control, unnecessary bureaucratic institution introduced because of that bill. And then the relevant cabinet member usually answered, Mr. Prime Minister, well, I'm sorry, we didn't have it in the original draft of the bill, but then we compare it with the obligatory EU legislation, and we understood that we have to include this into. So we are now 10 years ago, I started to say we are importing socialism from the EU.
Mr. President, I'm getting signals that your time is rapidly diminishing. You've been extremely generous with your time, by the way. Thank you. May I ask two final questions? They run as follows. In 1989, it seemed that some kind of decisive victory for freedom had been achieved.
Definitely.
It seems to me, however, it could be argued, well, Russia today, it could be argued, is less democratic than it was 15 years ago, say 5 years after. In Mrs. Thatcher's United Kingdom, her own party, the Conservative Party, has made an accommodation with large elements of the state. Here in the United States, the principal political movement at this moment is not toward freer markets, but toward bigger government. Would you have expected that 20 years ago?
No, well, I must say that, as I already suggested in our talk, the first post-communist decade was in this respect a very positive decade. The second is already much worse, and we are all of us, reintroducing socialism, reintroducing government intervention in all fields. Now it's not mostly because of the social ideas, social policy ideas, but it's now because of many other politically correct ideas, and the environment is one of the issues. For me, the global warming debate is another disaster which could lead us to a very controlled system.
Final question. We mentioned earlier that nobody under the age of 30 has any working memory of what the communist regimes were like. For your grandchildren, for my children, if you could reduce the lessons of the Cold War to one or two sentences, what do they need to hang on to? What do they need to understand and grasp about that experience?
I must say, I don't know. I have 5 grandchildren, and the oldest is 12 years old. The youngest, 7 years old. And 6 years old, and I don't know how to explain them. It's more the role of the parents than of grandparents, and when the grandparents are president of their country and don't have enough time to speak with them. Nevertheless, I think they
when your 12-year-old turns 18, you'll be out of office.
Well,
you sit this child down and say, listen, you must understand this about my life.
12 years old would now listen to this interview of mine and would try to understand what I was talking about. When I see him, I know that he is trying to do that already now. So maybe he would understand it.
President Klaus of the Czech Republic, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge and the Hoover Institution. Thanks for joining us.